Welcome to Pièces de Resistance, an extraordinary benefit series celebrating Alaska Quarterly Review's 40th anniversary. I'm Heather Lendy, and today we're having a celebration and discussion of Indigenous writing and writers. Join us most Sundays through April for live online readings and conversations featuring exceptional, new, emerging, and established poets and writers and teachers, as we have today, who've been published in Alaska Quarterly Review. The series is hosted by the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center. And while all of the events are free, AQR, like so many literary journals these days, could use your help. So please consider donation. Now I'd like to introduce Ronald Spatz, the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Alaska Quarterly Review, a professor of English at the University of Alaska. Ron is a former National Endowment for the Arts Fellow and the recipient of 2 Alaska Governor's Awards and a Contribution to Literacy Award from the Alaska Center for the Book. Under Ron's 4 decades of leadership and vision, Alaska Quarterly Review has created a strong connection between Alaska and the larger literary community in the US and abroad, and Canada, as we'll see today, and has been influential in supporting new and emerging writers, as well as presenting works that include a rigorous questioning of larger societal issues, which again are some of the things we'll be talking about today. Ron?
Thank you, Heather, and welcome everyone. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Alaska Quarterly Review YouTube channel. Alaska Quarterly Review gratefully acknowledges the Anchorage Museum for hosting and providing technical support for this event, and Web 907 for its web support, and the Center for the Narrative and Lyric Arts, Alaska Quarterly Review's 501c3 umbrella organization, which makes this event possible. I want to make a land acknowledgement. Alaska Quarterly Review recognizes the Indigenous land on which all Alaskans live. AQR is located in Anchorage, and Anchorage is Dena'ina homeland. Dena'ina is the Indigenous language spoken by traditional, present, and future caretakers of this land. Land acknowledgement opens a space with gratefulness and respect for the contributions, innovations, and contemporary perspective of Indigenous peoples, and marks our collective movement towards decolonization and equity. And now to begin. The first part of our program this afternoon will begin with Emily Wall and Kone Lance Twitchell's AQR collaborative poem, SHAAWATKE'E'S Birth, in Tlingit and English. We will present the short film of the poem that we produced. The second part of the program will focus on AQR's literary anthology, Carrying the Fire, celebrating the Indigenous voices of Canada, with collaborating editors Deanna Reder and Sophie McCall. Additionally, Deanna will present work from Honoring the Strength of Indian Women, and Sophie will provide an excerpt from her book, First Person Plural. And now Heather Lendy will introduce our presenters. Heather is the author of 4 books, all of nonfiction and all published by Algonquin. If you lived here, I'd know your name. Take Good Care of the Garden and the Dogs, Find the Good, which is this year's Alaska Reads book, and most recently, Of Bears and Ballads. Heather?
Thanks, Ron. And thank you to our writers who are here today. It's really a privilege to be in the same Zoom room with all of you. Emily Wall is the author of 3 full poetry collections, Breaking into Air, Birth Poems, forthcoming from Boreal Books, Red Hen Press, Live Aboard, and Freshly Rooted, both from Salmon Poetry, along with 3 chapbooks, including Flame from Minerva Rising Press. Her poems have appeared in a wide range of journals, including Alaska Quarterly Review, Prairie Schooner, Women Arts Quarterly, Room, Terrain, and Salamander. She lives in Douglas, across the bridge from Juneau, and is a writing professor at the University of Alaska Southeast. She says, I love teaching students how to write. In workshops with students, I focus on the work to create a supportive, safe environment where students can bring their stories and poems and share them with other students. After the birth of her daughter, Lucy, she realized that although women love exchanging birth stories, we never really treat them as art, she said. In Breaking into Air, she weaves birth poems she created from stories she received into a prose poem narrating the births of her own children and others. Ktunaxa Lance Twitchell is also a teacher at the University of Alaska Southeast. He's an associate professor of Alaska Native languages there and a 2020 Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellow from the First Nations Development Institute. Twitchell, who's Tlingit, Haida, Yupik, and Sami, will work to create a native language revitalization kit to be used by other Indigenous peoples that summarize how to replicate best practices in their own communities. He has said that recognition and acknowledgement from Indigenous organizations is medicine and power, and that he will do everything he can to help others achieve the success they dream about. Dr. Twitchell is also a recipient of the National Endowment for the Humanities Award to prepare a manuscript of transcribed and translated oral culture. In addition to the Alaska Quarterly Review, his poems have appeared in Yellow Medicine Review and Icebox. Deanna Reder is a Cree-Métis, hope I said that right, Deanna, scholar and associate professor in the departments of First Nations Studies and English at Simon Fraser University. Her book credits include Tell, Indigenous Stories from Turtle Island, and Honoring the Strength of Indian Women. She teaches courses in Indigenous popular fiction and Canadian Indigenous literatures, especially autobiography, and is a principal investigator in a partnership with co-applicants Dr. Marjorie Free and Cherokee scholar Dr. Daniel Heath Justice of the University of British Columbia on the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funded project called The People and the Text, Indigenous Writing in Northern North America up to 1992. She is also a founding member of the Indigenous Literary Studies Association, and in the fall of 2018 was inducted into the College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists in the Royal Society of Canada. Every time you hear a story, there are layers underneath it, she says, but what makes it Cree is the context, the relatives and connections you have. Sophie McCall is a settler scholar and associate professor in the English department at Simon Fraser. Sophie's main areas of research and teaching are Indigenous literatures and studies in Canada, contemporary Canadian literature from the 20th and 21st centuries, and diasporic writing and studies in reconciliation and transitional justice. She is the author of First Person Plural, Aboriginal Storytelling, and the Ethics of Collaborative Authorship, a finalist for the Gabrielle Roy Prize for English, Canadian Literary Criticism, and the Canada Prize for the Federation for the Humanities and Social Sciences, and the editor of Anahareo's Devil in Deerskins, the first book-length life narrative published by an Indigenous woman. She's co-editor with Deanna Reder, David Gaertner, and Gabrielle L'Hirondelle Hill of Read, Listen, Tell, Indigenous Stories from Turtle Island, and also collaborated with Hill on The Land We Are, Artists and Writers Unsettle the Politics of Reconciliation, which is a groundbreaking collection of writing and art that interrogates the current era of reconciliation in Canada. The contributions approach reconciliation as a problematic narrative about Indigenous settler relations, but also as a time where conversations about a just future must occur. So it's going to be a lot. We're going to learn a lot today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. And we're going to begin with the film, correct?
Yeah, Yak Echawe, Gulchish, Alaska Quarterly Review, Gulchish, Anchorage Museum, Wasach Huik E Yaeki, Gulchish Oe, Achuni Kach Inijini, Emily Wall, Gulchish Achshet Kachetki. Introducing this film, I want to say I've gotten in trouble several times because my wife has said, hey, that's my story. And so she is the one who did the birth. So I was there. I was a cheerleader. I was an invested partner. I read lots of books. I did everything that I could. But I just want to start by saying this is my wife's story and the story of my children. We have 3 children. I have spoken to each of them almost exclusively in the Tlingit language, which is something that may not have happened in 50 or 60 years. And so when our first child, Kayana, was born, I spoke to her only in Tlingit, and I studied a lot on how people did something like this. And before a second child was born, we had a visit from an elder named Randall Tetlichi, a Gwich'in elder who was living in Whitehorse. And he talked about when his children were born, he said before they were born, he asked everybody in the room to be quiet so that the first thing that they could hear would be the Gwich'in language. And so when our second child, SHAAWATKE'E'S, was born, that's what we did. And I thought a lot about what I might say. And when I held her, so I caught all 3 of the babies, it was really just magical. And as I pulled her up, like the things that I said were completely different than what I thought that I would say. And I thought about it for several days. I shared the post on social media just because I wanted to make sure I had a record of it somewhere. I used to keep journals. Now I keep a Facebook page or whatever. So, and as sort of Emily was working on this project, and I'm so grateful for her as a friend and colleague to reach out and talk about this idea of turning it into a collaborative poem. And so we worked through some ideas and settled on something that would be in Tlingit and in English. And it's not a translation, it's like a poetic conversation and just thinking about my kids and my wife and my family and this idea that a language can carry on through generations. So I hope you all enjoy it.
Kunishchish Kune, Kunishchish to Ron and AQR and to everybody who's here today. I think Heather and Kune just did a pretty perfect job of introducing what this project is. I did spend 5 years collecting birth stories, and I loved the diversity of voices I was getting from different mothers, different blending families, and I really, I wanted a dad. And Kune was right down the hall from me, and of course he is perfect because he right away told me this was his wife's story, and I was like, yep, he's the guy I want to talk to. So I asked him, as I had everyone, could I have your story? And what he gave me was so much more than a story. It was amazing to me. So he wrote down for me that birth speech that he gave to SHAAWATKE'E'S. And, you know, right away, I realized this was going to be something completely different. And I'm so thankful to him for giving me that and allowing me to weave some words around it. And the way I conceive it is that's the core of the poem. And then I relied heavily on Dick and Nora Dauenhauer's lessons about oral narrative, about how to structure the poem. I learned a lot from them. They were mentors of mine. And so that beautiful core, and I love that image of that father speaking that language as she's born. And I think the rest of it is just some framework for that beautiful core.
SHAAWATKE'E'S birth for Katla Mariah Twitchell. Chut yachyti.
Whirlpool.
Achyeti. Achyeti. Iiqa kutu washi. Iiqa kutu washi.
In this house of chaos, your sister learning language, your mother sleeping in the back room, my father leaving, my mother arriving, phone ringing, the long hours of light too bright. Listen, sometimes late at night, I place my hands on your mother's belly, place my hands on your skin house, and what my fingers see is your ears, small clamshells listening to the summer rain of Tlingit, the pattern of us tapping
into you. How shall I stack these words? What is the first word to give you?
We do ikla away. Khataya ish. Gunal cheesh.
Then comes that long summer night when we know you are coming. Your rich river breaks on the rock in the backyard, the rock under the cedar tree, and you are coming quickly, quickly in the birthing room. And now your tongue is a salmon, swimming downstream, heading for the ocean of sound, ready to take your first swallow of salt water, to taste your first vowel, rain on ocean, and your ear and tongue coming now too. And pain is here, and your mother in pain.
Wan qanins. Tachlitziaya kusti. Chahakatu wagat. Ya nanan hayu qatangi. Iin qua. Ke guchlitzin. Hallingitr sati.
And what I know to do is this. And what I know to do is this. I ask that we turn down the lights. I ask that no one speak. Your first sound above water will be the language of black feathers, the language of flight. I ease into the water, feel your head. Feel its turning until a furled ear emerges and another, your body coming, swimming into the sound, rising into the sound of my voice. I hold the air around you. I blow softly into your ear to open its listening.
Wush tudzakhan hayu qatangi in. Wush tudzakhan hayu qatangi in.
We love each other, and this is your language. We love you in this language. We love you, and this is you sliding wetly into my hands, your seal soft mouth opening, and you have the most beautiful tongue I've ever seen. Strong organ at the center of the world. Strong voice at the center of my world.
Gunal cheesh. Ye awa.
That was just beautiful. Just beautiful.
Wow, I've seen it before, but it's so powerful. Really wonderful writing, and it was so well done, you two. How old is she now?
Sheesh. She's 7, and I'm somehow 100 years older than I was. But credit to them. Yeah, they're fabulous. And there's one more, he's 5. And so they all understand Tlingit, they could speak it pretty well. And yeah, I'm just really grateful for the work that went into that.
So amazing. Shall I jump in now?
Yes.
Okay. I just want to thank you so much, Kune and Emily. That was just gorgeous. And I want to begin by introducing myself. I have family from all over the Canadian prairies. My Cree and Métis family, Cree-speaking Cree-Métis family are from northern Saskatchewan. And my mother was a Cree language speaker. I only know a few words of swearing or words of endearment. And I think you're really living a dream that a lot of Indigenous people, all over, really want, is to be able to pass on not just our culture, but the seeing of the world through the language. So that was just so amazing. Thank you so much. And so even though I live, I as an Indigenous person in Canada, I'm, however, a guest on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, the Musqueam, and the Tsleil-Waututh people. And I'm very, very blessed to be here. Also very, very blessed to be working at my university with my colleague and my chief, my co-conspirator, Sophie McCall, because it's not very often, at least in Canadian universities, where you have two experts in Indigenous literatures. And so, I mean, really, we're still quite, our Indigenous literatures are still pretty tangential in the curriculum at the university, and we're working to change that. I have to take a moment to hold up Alaska Quarterly Review. Yes, because it has really helped us with a big initiative that I want to share with you. And then I'm going to ask Sophie also to talk a little bit about the Indigenous Voices Awards before we go on. And that is, Sophie and I were on the executive of something called the Indigenous Literary Studies Association. We call it ILSA. It was only started in 2013. Our first conference was 2015. And that was where we could come together to talk about Indigenous literatures, not in Canadian literature or North American literature forums, but just together by ourselves. And with a real wanting to do it in a different way, where we have a real responsibility to Indigenous communities and to writers. And it was at that moment, in soon after we were getting things going and working together, that there was a huge Canadian crisis. And if you want to know more about it, you can actually read the introduction, where there's interviews by several of us. We're part of responding to this key crisis in Canada, where the result was a crowdfunding campaign to support emerging Indigenous writers that was supposed to reach about 10,000 and actually went up to 115,000. And really showing, I think, at a moment of reconciliation, a sense that Canadians wanted our writers to be supported and heard and have publishing opportunities, which of course has been a historical problem. And so because we were part of ILSA, Sophie and I and a couple of other people were the first to respond. And in fact, we've organized an awards in 2018, in 2019, and then we just had, because of COVID, a virtual gala in 2020. And it was amazing how it's grown and grown and grown, partly even just in this short period of time, not only the response by the writers, but the actual happy results. So I would like to just read you the shortest of little poems from this, because it is a student that was actually a student of mine and Sophie's as an undergraduate, who went off to do a master's, and Smokey is now doing his PhD. And it just gives you a little bit of a voice of the kind of, it's young and very involved, at least at one voice. I don't want to make anybody representative of anybody, but we're really proud of Sophie, of Smokey. And this poem is called, and by the way, this was won the award in the first year as an unpublished poetry, and in the second year it had been published and it won again. So it's a twice winning poem. Okay, what you don't understand. What you don't understand is that for the Indigenous person in your life, Colton is family. Colton is me. Colton is my brother. Barbara is my mom's name. Barbara is my auntie. Barbara is our grandma. Tina is our niece, our little sister, our baby girl. What you don't understand: when you survive genocide, everyone left is family. And in this poem, Smokey lists the names of people who have passed because of colonial violence and have wrenched the hearts of many of us. And we're so proud, though, that this new generation of writers are able to make sure nobody forgets. So Sophie, do you want to tell the story a bit about how this came into publication, though? I mean, how this got into this book?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, Deanna. It was a beautiful serendipitous event where Ron Spatz came to Vancouver to work on some archives and to work with Deanna, I believe. And we were looking for how to help publish the work of the finalists of the first group of emerging Indigenous writers who had either been finalists or winners in that competition. And so Ron Spatz got very excited, and his positivity and his encouragement was invaluable in getting all the pieces together, and we created a dialogic introduction between the organizers, explaining a little bit about the history of the IVAs and explaining its importance. And basically, part of the problem in literary prize culture is how just one voice becomes celebrated and representative somehow, especially with minority communities. Somehow the one successful writer starts representing all Indigenous writers, and that can be a tremendously damaging situation that can unfold. So we really wanted these awards to foster a vibrant collaborative community that could connect established writers with emerging writers, to help mentor those emerging writers, to help introduce writers to the often quite intimidating processes of publishing, editing, and not only intimidating, but downright excluding processes where there's a whole history of destructive editing practices. And so how to use the community to create support and connections between writers. And I just wanted to mention specifically that the Indigenous Voices Awards does have a category for Indigenous languages. And Kune, if you know of Indigenous writers within your community, emerging Indigenous writers, please encourage them to submit their work this year. The competition opens in December. And the winner last year was Cole Pauls, who wrote a graphic novel, Dakwakata Warriors in Southern Tachone. And so it's an extraordinary book. It's a wonderful, quirky, beautifully drawn story, but its main goal, according to Cole Pauls, is to teach community members more of the language. So that was really thrilling. And as Deanna mentioned, this AQR special issue was for some of the writers the very first time to get into print. And for some of them, becoming a finalist in the Indigenous Voices Awards opened up opportunities to publish their work. So Smoky Sumac is one example that Deanna mentioned, but there's several others who, from that first running of the competition, ended up publishing their work in their own books. So it's really wonderful to see that emphasis on many voices. And we also have many categories, and it's the only award that offers an award to Indigenous writers writing in the French language globally. There's no other award for Indigenous writers working in the French language. So all of these things it was truly my honor and my privilege to be a part of this and to work closely with Deanna Reder, who I often call my general, and we she's just such a wonderful colleague and friend to be able to work with, and I just feel so fortunate to have been a part of so many wonderful projects, including this one.
And there's a certain beautiful connection between the kind of work we've done in the Indigenous Voices Awards with our own research. So of course, Sophie's been able to bring back the work by Anahareo. And I've had the incredible, great privilege to work on the Ktunaxa-Secwepemc writer archive of Vera Manuel. Now, some of you might be familiar with the Indigenous leader, George Manuel. Well, this is actually, Vera is his daughter. And even though there was a play called Strength of Indian Women that was published, she left a mountain of other plays unpublished, although performed locally. She had a bunch of poetry sporadically published here and there, never in full. And then she sadly passed in 2010, sitting in her sister's dresser drawer after she passed were 4 perfect stories, 3 that had never been published. And, I had written some of them written in 1988, still with the critical remarks by the creative writing teacher. And so when Vera's sister Emmeline, the poet Joanne Arnott, Algonquin scholar Michelle Coppell, and I got together because we wanted to help Emmeline bring together the work of her sister. It was going into that dresser drawer, that piece of paper that might have just gone lost forever. And instead, in the middle of the volume are these perfect little stories. And I'm just going to read you a little bit as a taste. I can tell you, other than maybe some standardization of spelling, we didn't change a word. And this is a picture of Vera in costume. And she is a really beautiful person, a very intelligent person. Keeping in mind, this is written in 1988, when people would say that a lot of the critique of residential schools didn't really exist because nobody really understood what was going on. Well, by reading this, she and her family and community knew what the damage that had been wrought upon them, but also understood it in a much deeper, more political way. So this is called That Gray Building, and it's a story of a woman, the author's mother, taking the grandmother around to the old residential schools. And so they're talking while driving in a car. My grandmother, your great grandmother, she said to me, was a very strong and powerful woman. She never allowed anyone to push her around. As my mother spoke, I could feel the tension easing out of her, and the tone of her voice became stronger. The first few times when we had to go into town to buy supplies, those white storekeepers would make fun of the way she used to talk. She spoke barely any English, but she sure could tell those white people off in Indian. Eventually, they learned to leave her alone. If she ever saw them picking on an Indian, she'd be right there, never allowing them to get away with it. She didn't have much respect for white people, and she never trusted them at all. This is our land, she would tell me. Every inch of it has been given to us by the Creator. Since the beginning of time, Indian people have lived between these mountains. This is where the Creator put us, she'd say. Then she would stop the horse and make me get down and walk with her on the land. It has been our job since the beginning of time to take care of this land and of every single living thing that was put here on it. Every Indian person knows that we are the caretaker for this land, and that is what you must teach your children and your children's children. Our people must never forget that this is our land. Someday, many people will try to tell you and your children that this is not your land. You must promise me that you will never believe them, and that you will never allow your children to believe without the land an Indian is nothing. I was just a small child when she told me those things, my mother said. And ever since then, almost everything that she ever told me has happened. As she spoke, I came around a bend in the road that opened into a spectacular view of the valley where my grandmother had lived, and something silently omnipotent passed from my mother to me. Whenever I start feeling weak, I always come back to the land to regain my strength. The land is where our strength comes from, she said. Thank you.
Well, that's a wonderful passage to read from that book, and I've taught that book in my graduate course on Indigenous literatures, and so that is such a key idea and passage from the book. So thank you so much for that. I meant to speak to you about this book, First Person Plural, Aboriginal Storytelling and the Ethics of Collaborative Authorship. And my kids always laugh at me that it's the longest title they've ever heard any book have, which is certainly true. I don't know how many syllables, but a lot. And in this book, I look at works very, very similar to Kune and Emily's collaboration. I look at text, but also film and some performance where there's generally an Indigenous narrator or storyteller working with a non-Indigenous writer, editor, translator. Although I certainly also look at collaborations within Indigenous communities, among Indigenous artists of the same community. So I address that complex interweaving of linguistic, cultural, and material aspects of mistranslation and miscommunication that's often involved in collaborative text. So I look at those positive examples of collaboration, but I also am aware of that history of that misrepresentation and mistranslation. And one of the most important phrases that really guided me through that work actually came from Tlingit elder, Angela Sidney. And the book by Julie Cruikshank in collaboration with Angela Sidney, Kitty Smith, and Annie Ned was one of the most important works. And that was the result of Julie Cruikshank getting to know elders in Alaska. And Angela Sidney said to Julie Cruikshank, "My stories are my wealth." And that phrase, I think, really emphasizes those connections between story and land, and the importance of a telling, which is always very deliberately provided to a listener for particular reasons. And it matters who tells stories to whom and under what circumstances. And so that statement that was made in the early 1970s was so formative for me in writing First Person Plural, and continues to resonate as a powerful reminder of the material contexts of storytelling protocols, questions of authorship, and relations of address. So it's Ron, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about this briefly. To this particular audience, it's really special to meet you all.
I think we've got, it looks like we have about 15 minutes or so, and it would be, I think it'd be very enlightening to have you all have a conversation about some of the things that you've brought up. The one that struck me that I think all of you could participate in is the what Deanna talked about, the destructive editing practices that went on, you know, as a writer, and then someone that sometimes edits people, I would like to hear more about that, what that means and how to avoid it.
Sophie, actually, Sophie and I are in, Sophie wrote something for Greg Younging's Elements of Indigenous Style. I'm not sure, Kane or Emily, are you familiar with it in Alaska at all? So Sophie and I are both friends of the late Greg Younging. He passed just a year and a half ago, I guess, and unexpectedly. He was only really about 60 years old, but he had a life. He had been the one of the first editors for Thetis Press, coming out of the Anaukin School, which is in Kelowna. Now the University of British Columbia, Okanagan is associated with them. And he had really done his PhD working on the intellectual property of Indigenous peoples and the sort of style needs there. And so I don't know, Sophie, you had more experience with Greg and doing the interviews and things for this. Maybe you should talk a bit more about it, but it certainly is something we're part of, is trying to change that history, which is difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think it's meant to be a handbook, and it's meant to provide guidance where there has been really only silence to editors and publishers about the responsibilities of sharing stories. And the history of Indigenous writing, especially in Canada, is one that's filled with misplaced manuscripts, manuscripts languishing in archives for 10, 20, 30 years, passages being rearranged or deleted without the permission of the authors and being published without that permission. In one case, Life Among the Kalunat by Minnie Ayola Freeman, her book was published, and something like 9,000 copies after publication got lost and was found something like 10 years or 15 years later in the basement of the Indian agent's home or office. So censorship can sometimes take place, not where we have like border officials saying this is pornographic, you can't publish this, but more these unbelievable delays or these, sort of misplaced manuscripts, and as I say, or not cared for or not respected creations. So that's where the silencing can take place. And in the case of Minnie Freeman, she believed that the reason was that she spoke badly of residential schools. And in the 70s, that was just not okay. And so I think that's just one example, but Deanna's been working with a Cree writer that you might want to speak about, Anahareo, and the many delays and that continue today in getting his work but more widely circulated.
I really am happy to talk to you about Edward Anahareo, and also there's the work of a grad student that Sophie and I worked with, who found a missing passage in a really canonical text. If you know a work by an Indigenous person in Canada in the 20th century, the most important one, I would argue, is Maria Campbell's Half-Breed. And just before publication in 1973, when she very bravely insisted that an episode where she, at the age of 14, had been raped by the police, she insisted to her publishers that it needed to be in there, and she had consulted her own lawyers, and she did this as a poor woman, first-time author. She, not the amazing Maria Campbell, now know. Just before publication, the editors of the text just yanked out the passage and told her that they had no copy of it, that it was all destroyed. And it was our student, Alex Shields, who went to the archives and found it. And she and I were able to go and contact Maria Campbell, and following local protocols, bring them back to her. And she's not only reissued the book, or well, McClellan and Stewart has, but in fact, there's an audio book now with Maria Campbell herself, who's now about 80 years of age, telling the story. And I mean, it is just such an honor. And I mean, I would love to tell you about more of the authors, but I do want a sense of what's happening in Alaska with in publishing Indigenous authors. What's the infrastructure like? You know, what are your students doing? What's happening there?
Well, yeah, this is a great conversation. I guess I would sort of start by saying I really appreciate what was shared just a moment ago, and that Indigenous communities are not the garden bed for white PhDs, which has been the history. So people will come in, do research, harvest stories, and go and publish their work, and sort of maybe never be heard from again. And at times, some academic institutions will take Indigenous languages and stuff and make it inaccessible to the community, either by not actually letting them engage in that or not allowing them to take it and to continue to work with it. So there's accusations of plagiarism. There's insinuations that Indigenous peoples don't have the level of expertise to even work with their own language. And so in the field of literature, though, we do have wonderful Indigenous voices across the state. And so here in Juneau alone, you have a bit of an explosion of content from fabulous voices like Ernestine Hayes and Ishmael Hope and Frank Katas, and then Vera Starbird. And so we have things that are going onto the stage as plays and that are being published in terms of memoir and poetry. And I think we can continue to develop that. A lot of my work is in Indigenous languages. And so I would love to see basically a publishing house in Alaska that focused solely on Indigenous languages. I try to convince people to publish stuff just in Tlingit, but I end up just going the route of self-publishing because the audience is small. And so, but I do think that there's more. And so with Molly of Denali, there's a whole cohort of writers. I'm involved with that as a cultural consultant and also as a writer. And so it's been really great to see that project, as there's a whole bunch of episodes, and the majority of episodes are written by non-Indigenous writers, but then they have a goal of producing more and more from Indigenous writers through a fellowship program where you're really getting access to tools, and then you're getting access to collaborative processes, which are really different. Like doing a PBS show is really different than writing a poem, because then you're going to get feedback from 7 different people, including PBS, who says, like, you know, all these different kids can't touch sharp objects and stuff like that. And you're trying to champion for pilot bread, but nobody understands what pilot bread is outside of Alaska, I guess. So I think it's on the rise, but it's also, we've had struggle because Alaska Native faculty, we're 20% of the University of Alaska as far as students, but we're 3% of the faculty. And so trying to look at that and say, well, where are the role models? Where are the voices? As someone as powerful and as incredibly earth-shaking as Ernestine Hayes retires, now we have no faculty who are teaching creative writing who are Indigenous. And so, but these are things because also there's a budget freeze, and there's no end in sight to the ongoing budget decline. And so the university structure becomes this sort of system where everybody's kind of fighting to just hold on to what they've got. And so nobody, well, I wouldn't say nobody, but there's not enough of a critical mass who are ready to engage in how do we make sure there's equity before we fight for what we're trying to hold on to. And this is a really tough conversation. But I do think, I love hearing about award programs and ideas that are really just looking for innovative ways to go and to harvest this content. And there's material that's being published, also translation work. I think there's a future for an ongoing creation of Indigenous media in terms of animation and film. And Princess Johnson is really out in front, helping to lead the way with some of that content in addition to Molly of Denali. So it's on the rise, but we got our work cut out for us. We got our struggles. Everybody's got inequity, and so everybody's trying to punch their way through that and also keep the pen moving at the same time.
I have a question maybe for both Emily and Ron as editors, or at least advisors for literary journals. How do you encourage Indigenous writing, or do you see as Lance was speaking, the the disparity between the number of students and what is published or what comes through, up to that level of a literary journal? Is there,
We, I think we did the in many editions now, the Alaska Native Writers, Storytellers, and Orators edition, and you have copies down there at Simon Fraser, and again, our mentors included Gary Holthouse and Dick and Nora Dowenauer to phrase it, and then Pat Partnow and Jean Breinig. I mean, one of the things to realize is that when I reach out to culturally specific work, I think it's absolutely essential to have people in the culture making the decisions. So I might have a vision, which I do, but there's a difference between a vision and the actual knowledge to deal with the line by line, so that something important doesn't get missed because of kind of a cultural blind spot. The other thing that I wanted to, and we've done a number of features on Alaska Natives, I mean, including the people that Lance suggested, but also others. But we're very careful. I won't take it on unless I know what I'm doing. Particularly if it makes the case that it's a cultural representation. Now, we've had Alaska Native writers in the regular editions. That's a different thing than actually putting it into a work where it absolutely represents the culture too, if you make the distinction of that. And I just wanted to say, before we run out of time, I wanted to ask the question, is it possible so we can, with this collaboration that we had with our edition, and then this wonderful presentation, two things. One, you had said that Alaska Native writers could be welcome to submit to the Indigenous Writers Awards. Is that true?
That's, yeah, I might have actually, that might not be true. Okay. I was getting excited about the border crossing nature, of course, of many nations, right? Across the Canadian and US border, my goodness, on every border that is the case. And I was thinking about I was wondering if Kune or Emily or any of you knew of Dakwakata Warriors, the graphic novel that did win last year for Indigenous languages. But yeah, I might have misspoke there, actually.
Well, that would be a cool thing to see if it could be. This is the thing, not necessarily taking your program and changing it, but maybe creating some kind of an opening, because of the nature that you have a much larger pool and it already exists. We wouldn't have to worry about the infrastructure so much. The second thing is that, as we learned as Americans, and hopefully that's going to change at least by 5 million more votes than the other, in terms of this ridiculous view of, in my opinion, of borders. Mm-hmm. It's all about keeping people out, keeping cultures out, keeping information out, as opposed to what's in. And in Alaska, like Canada, we have 21 Alaska Native languages and cultures. It would be, and Canada is so rich. And there's no border, okay? There is no border between some of those languages. So the border is entirely artificial. And it would be so, and I think there's a real connection between the Alaska Native writers and the Canadian Indigenous writers because of the northern part of North America. I just saw a beautiful anthology come out of Indigenous writing, edited by Joy Harjo. It's great, and it has a little section that is our region, and there was one of the poems from Alaska Quarterly that's included. But you know, this would just be something. You guys are awesome, and you're right. I got excited working with you, and so the idea is there would be a possibility of expanding something that could invite Alaska to be a part of this. And we don't have a regular council, Canadian council in Alaska. We have an honorary one, but she was very excited about this project. So I'm going to make sure, she said she sent it down to Seattle to the Council General there, and we'll send her the link to this YouTube and the book, because this is a way to build a state that this is Alaska Quarterly's vision. We're outward facing. And outward facing means that not that we don't like where we are, but we see where we are in a larger and more connected way. So anyway, just something to think about. And I'm sorry I took so much time up with it, but it seemed like another opportunity to just explore with you folks.
Yeah, I mean, especially on the question of language. I totally agree with you that these borders are completely artificial, and you know, Tlingit is just as much a part of BC and Northwest Territories and Yukon as it is of Alaska. So yeah,
it would be so inspiring to our Tlingit speakers here, I think, to know that there was that happening. I also think we're very lucky to have Mikhail and Michael D'Angeli, who are Tsimshian performers, dancers, and really working to revitalize the language and thinking about, of course, the stories of their communities on your side of the border as well. So there are definite, Ron's right, there's definite potential and forward thinking. Yeah.
Well, you'll hear from us again, Sophie and Deanna, because you know, our host is the Anchorage Museum, and everybody knows that the director of that museum is absolutely committed to this kind of outward facing exploration. And so maybe we can do more in the future, even I'm not even talking necessarily publication, but in terms of presentation and so on. Because when I got to Simon Fraser, I was so impressed with what you folks did. It took 10 years to get a colonial painting down that somebody in advancement thought was a great idea to take from a bank. Not only was it colonial and reduced Indigenous people to artifacts, but there were no women on it until the very end. It was just one woman who was getting educated. It took the entire history of British Columbia for one woman to get 1 degree. It was an extraordinary thing. It took you guys 10 years to get it off, and I got there just in time to see a great victory. And it was that, because people were saying, well, just put something in front of it, and so there's balance. But it's like some of these conversations we have in the US, it's not everything being equal. It's not two sides to every story. There are some things, when they're presented as equal, they're very damaging, and they're not equal. And so, you know, anyway, this is the most I've talked at the end of one of these things. So I better stop, because Heather's
it's 4 o'clock, and it's not keep everybody too long, Ron. That's my job. I did. I want to read Vera Manuel's story. So thank you for that. That's the next place I'm going to go. But I also wanted to just acknowledge that here in Southeast Alaska, and really the world, lost a great orator, storyteller, cultural leader in David Katzik not too long ago. And I had the honor of listening to him speak at a Kuiks in Klukwan. He was born in Klukwan, which is near Haines. And he said something that I always remember, and I've heard you all echo it a little bit. He said, you know, when he was asked, well, you know, what's a great speech? How do you make a great speech? And he said, sometimes the greatest speech you can make is gunul cheese, is thank you. And And then I spoke with him after that as a non-native person, and I said, well, should I say thank you? What if I can't pronounce Gunalchish? And he said, doesn't matter. That's the speech you need to make. That's the most important speech you can make, Heather, is Gunalchish. You say it back to us that way. And I remembered that forever, and I just wanted to close with a Gunalchish to Hootnay and to Deanna Reder and to Emily and Sophie and Ron for just opening up this discussion. And I realize we've just, hardly touched on it, but there's a lot here. And I also want to make a little pitch for those of you who appreciate this kind of discussion and the kind of publication that champions these things and is aware of this and working on it is, that Alaska Quarterly Review, this is a fundraiser. And so if you've enjoyed this hour with us and the rest of the series, please consider making a small donation. And I wanted to thank, as always, the Anchorage Museum at the Rasmussen Center and Cody Carver for producing the show today. So, and I'll let Ron close out and introduce what's coming next week.
Yeah, we're going to be in December, so there's going to be a little bit of a break. And on December 6th, we have an environmentally focused program with Nancy Lord, a former Alaska state writer, Eva Solitis, who was one of our gems of the writing community, who passed away way too young. Her sister will be reading part of her book, Into Great Silence, and an East Coast environmental writer, Richard Adams Carey. So that is at 3:00 Alaska time, 7 p.m. Eastern time on Sunday, December 6th. And December 13th, we have Sierra Freeman alone. She's an African-American performance poet, and she's wonderful. And so we're hoping to have you again to join us, and Gunalchish to all